The book of John tells of how Jesus was teaching in the temple when the Pharisees brought in a woman who had just been caught in the act of adultery. They asked Jesus what should be done with the woman, reminding him that the law called for her to be stoned to death. Their intention was to test Jesus, and while the nature of this test was not explicitly spelled out in Scripture, we can see how Jesus might have felt pinched between the demands of the law and a reasonable desire to show the woman mercy. Perhaps the watching crowd expected to see his famed wisdom at work, and they anticipated something more than a blunt black-and-white application of the law. So what could a person say in this situation? What might you say? Well, when you think about it, it actually doesn't take that much imagination to come up with some pretty good ideas. Even lacking Jesus' supposed supernatural wisdom, it's probable that you, availing yourself of nothing more than basic human insight, could come up with an intelligent way to flesh out the nuance of this situation. Your first instinct might be to address the nature of the law in question. You could challenge the practice of treating adultery as a capital crime, or condemn stoning as a barbaric and inhumane form of punishment. If you are well versed in the Pentateuch, as Jesus was, you might discuss the sexist implications of the law, including the fact that a woman cheating on her husband is considered adultery, while men cheating on their wives is never condemned, and at times actually seems to be celebrated. You might take the opportunity to discuss issues of suspicion and jealousy in marriage, giving insight into mature and constructive ways to process these feelings, explaining that poisoning a woman to see if she miscarries, as allowed in Old Testament law, might not be the best solution. Among other things, such ideas could have helped Jesus articulate the transition from the Old Testament to modern Christianity. Or if you wanted to deal with a specific situation, you might ask how she was caught, inquiring into the details of the scenario to find out what her role was and if the encounter was even consensual. And if it was, you might want to ask about the surrounding circumstances of the adultery, not necessarily to excuse the woman's actions, but possibly to see if there was any room for leniency. This could be used to launch into an adultery of the heart type lesson on the fact that it's a person's motivations, not just a specific act, that help us determine the nature of a person's guilt or innocence, and that this might help shed light on how justice and rehabilitation might best be worked out for all involved. Hell, at the very least, you might ask where the f***ing man is and why he hadn't also been dragged back to the temple for punishment. Once you think about it, all these insights are pretty obvious, even by the standards of basic common sense. And in fact, a situation like this would more or less demand that at least one or two of these considerations be brought up. But what did Jesus say? He started by retorting to the Pharisees, "Let him who is without sin cast the first stone." These words ring down through history, touted by Christians as exemplifying Jesus' divine wisdom. And on the surface, it does seem a little insightful. We all do things wrong after all, so is it not hypocritical to literally or figuratively throw stones at other people for their sins while turning a blind eye to our own? Well, in this case, no. The woman's behavior was not just a sin, it was a capital crime. And the Pharisees, far from lashing out as an angry mob, had brought her back to the temple to face legal execution. So unless Jesus were to challenge the law at hand, which he did not, he was left with only two reasonable options. He could either dispute the facts of the case or call for leniency based on extenuating circumstances. But he did neither of these things. Instead, his challenge to the Pharisees was based solely on the fact that they themselves had sinned, and by mounting it, he was essentially saying that a crime could never be prosecuted unless everybody involved in carrying out the punishment was perfect. This idea, of course, is absurd, and if put into practice, it would completely overturn law and order. But for some reason, the Pharisees actually took this nonsense seriously and just left, at which time Jesus told the woman, "Go and sin no more." In doing this, Christians say, Jesus rounds out his message of mercy by showing the woman that he took her sin seriously and expected her to change. In a way, this is true. But when you actually consider the baggage that accompanies an affair, the deep-seated emotional and behavioral patterns that lead to infidelity, and the marital challenges, not to mention possible domestic abuse that this woman was likely to face at home, this is an absurdly flippant response. Is adultery wrong? Certainly. But if there was ever a situation that called for Jesus to follow up with some serious insight and counsel, this was it. Instead, however, he basically just told her to quit it. So even by the standards of common sense, both things Jesus said in this story were pretty underwhelming at best, and I think we demonstrated that most of us could have come up with something better to say in this situation. But here's the thing. For the purpose of this story, it really doesn't even matter. Why? Because the gospel writers were not mainly concerned with passing on wisdom. They were more interested in writing narratives that showed Jesus getting the better of his religious and political opponents. And they used story structure, not actual wisdom, to achieve this goal. See, this tale follows a basic storytelling convention that's used repeatedly throughout the Gospels. Over and over, religious leaders come to Jesus with a question, a problem, or an argument. Jesus, of course, is always ready with a quick retort that instantly puts them in their place. And if we ever see a reaction from religious leaders, they're always immediately stumped, walking away in shame or running off to plot his death, because, of course, they're jealous that he keeps embarrassing them in public. It's a plot device that's as old as time, and a really cheap trick. To make the hero of a story sound smart, and, when applicable, show his opponents looking dumb, all a person has to do is write a convenient outcome to the end of the story. As a point of comparison, we can look to the Sherlock Holmes stories. Arthur Conan Doyle got away with having Holmes make totally far-fetched deductions based on the thinnest pieces of evidence, not because his methods made sense, but because, as the author, Doyle had the power to vindicate Holmes at the end. The Gospels do the same thing with Jesus. He could literally say anything in any argument, and he always wins because the authors have the luxury of either cutting off the story when he's finished or portraying the Pharisees and Sadducees as baffled by whatever he said. But evaluated on their objective merit, Jesus' responses in these stories range from oversimplification to idiotic nonsense to complete non sequitur, and it's implausible to think that anybody, much less the most highly educated religious and legal minds of the day, would have been so quickly stumped by such basic arguments. In the case of Jesus and the adulteress, do we really think that not one of the Pharisees would have thought to say something as simple as, yeah, Jesus, everybody sinned, but that's no reason to stop enforcing the law. Just think of how blindingly obvious that objection is. Then visualize all the elaborate counter-arguments that might have come from people as well-studied and articulate as the Pharisees and Sadducees, and this narrative of them standing in embarrassed silence every time Jesus pops off a one-liner starts to look really, really silly. Even assuming Jesus' arguments were good, no debate is settled as quickly and decisively as those we see in the Gospels. They play out with a long, sometimes frustrating exchange of points and counterpoints that reveal either how complex the topic is, or, at the very worst, how doggedly a person can defend bad ideas. That's how real discussion goes. It's messy, it's uncomfortable, and it usually causes us to question at least some of our preconceptions. But since we don't like this messy reality, we enjoy the counter-narrative of our side quickly and decisively silencing everybody who disagrees with us. But this narrative is a stupid fantasy, and by so brazenly employing it, the Gospels are engaged in nothing more than childishly obvious propaganda. To get a sense of this, just read a few of these stories for yourself. Look at how mediocre or nonsensical some of Jesus' arguments are, how easily these arguments baffle his opponents, and what cartoonishly bumbling idiots they're portrayed as. It won't take much to recognize that not only are these not eyewitness accounts, but they're formulaic constructions that never happened anywhere.